Colorado's high country, 1885. Below Juniper Flat, Dyani's father lay dying of a debt he could not pay, and the night she agreed to marry a stranger to save her family would change everything she believed about love, money, and her own worth. Morning mist hung low over the foothills that day, silvering the rocks behind the cabin where Dyani knelt in the thin garden, pulling weeds from soil too cold and too poor to give back much. Her dress was patched at both elbows, her dark hair braided plain, and tied with a strip of red cloth her mother had once worn before the fever took her, years back, when Dyani was still small enough to be carried on a hip through the aspens. She was 22 now, quick-handed and clear-eyed, and worry had already carved a line between her brows that did not belong on a woman so young. Inside the cabin, her father's cough shook the thin walls again, the same rattling cough that had followed him out of the mine 2 winters back, and never once let him go. Years underground chasing silver that never paid out had ruined his lungs and left the family owing more than the claim itself was worth. On the shelf by his bed sat a tin box of letters from a bank in Denver, each one colder than the last. Her younger brother Kai and her little sister Nita still ran barefoot over the rocks below the cabin, laughing the easy laugh of children who had not yet been told how bad things truly were. Dyani's mother had come from a camp 2 valleys east, an Apache woman who married a miner and never once stopped teaching her daughter to read the land the way her own grandmothers had, the color a stream ran after heavy rain, the way a slope held or let go of its topsoil, the difference between a forest that would stand 100 more years and one already dying on its feet. Those lessons had outlasted her mother by a decade, now carried forward in small habits Dyani rarely thought to name, the way she watched a hillside before she trusted it, the way she counted a season's snowpack against the height of last year's grass. Her father had leaned on that knowledge more than he ever said aloud, and some nights, watching her work the garden or study the sky before a storm, he looked at her the way a man looks at something he knows he does not deserve to keep much longer. That night the wind worked at the shutters, while Dyani sat by the low fire, mending a shirt gone thin at the collar. Her father stared into the flames a long while before his voice finally broke the quiet, worn down to almost nothing. The claim could not carry him much longer. The mine had taken his wind along with his strength, and the bank in Denver would not wait past the season. She would need a husband soon, a man who could carry the family through the winter coming for them. Shame rode under every word, but he did not take a single one of them back. Dyani kept her hands moving on the needle so he would not see them shake. She did not want to be traded off against a debt the way a man trades off a mule. She wanted to choose, or at least to believe she had chosen. But when his breath caught in his chest and she saw the fear plain in his eyes, the argument died in her throat before it ever reached her lips. Later, when the cabin slept, Dyani sat alone at the rough table with a stub of candle and a borrowed book open before her, pages full of iron railroads and cities she had never once laid eyes on. For a little while, the words made the small room feel wider than it truly was. She had taught herself to read from that same worn book 2 winters running, sounding out the hard words by firelight until they came easy, and some nights she let herself believe there was a version of her life bigger than a played-out claim at the end of a canyon road. A firm knock broke the quiet, not timid, but steady, the knock of a man who already knew exactly why he had come. Her father took up the old rifle from behind the door and answered it himself. On the porch stood a tall man with frost caught in his dark beard and moonlight lying flat across his shoulders, wrapped in a worn leather coat gone soft at the seams. His eyes were calm and pale, and they went straight past the rifle into the room. When her father lowered the gun an inch, the man stepped inside and took off his hat. His name, he told them, was Holt Bracken, a mountain man holding a claim of his own higher up in the range. Word of the family's trouble had reached him, the way word travels fast and unkind through a small county. He was no rich man, that much he made plain from the start. but he had strong hands, steady work, and a roof that did not leak. If Dyani chose to become his wife, he would clear the worst of what was owed in Denver, and see that the family had food and wood enough to last through winter. His voice stayed slow, and even the whole time without a trace of charm in it, the flat honesty of a man used to being believed the first time he opened his mouth. Kai and Nita watched wide-eyed from the loft ladder. Her father, doubled over coughing, had to lean hard on the table to stay upright. What did he truly want out of a bargain like this one? The question hung in the smoke a moment before Holt gave his answer plain as the first. A partner, not a decoration. A woman who could work, who would stand at his side. When the weather turned hard, the way weather in that country always eventually did. He had watched Dyani in town, he added, hauling sacks twice her own size and arguing the assayer down to a fair weight, holding her family together while the whole valley pushed the other way. She was stronger, he believed, than Juniper Flat would ever give her credit for, and the choice, he made certain to add before he left, belonged to her and no one else. He would not drag her anywhere against her will. He set his hat back on his head and walked out into the dark. For 3 days the trading post buzzed with little else. Women murmured after church about the miner's poor daughter and the mountain man who wanted her for a wife. Men at the counter watched Holt with narrow, careful eyes, muttering just loud enough to be overheard that nobody rode down out of the high country with an offer like that, unless he had something worth hiding behind it. Dyani heard every whisper of it while she counted out flour and salt twice over to make the coins stretch further. Holt came by at dusk and sat on the porch rail as the sky went the deep blue-black of a mountain evening. He never once pressed her for an answer. Instead, he talked about the high country, the deep snow, the clear water, valleys nobody from Juniper Flat had ever laid eyes on, and about the railroads and the big timber companies pushing further into land that had stood untouched for longer than anyone could count. The world was changing fast. That much was plain in every line of him, and a person could either let it run them down or learn to ride out ahead of it. If a story like Dyani's is the kind that keeps you watching, tap join beside the channel name and become a channel member. It helps frontier stories like hers keep coming. 2 days later, the creditors rode in from Denver, on clean horses, coats too neat for the dust they raised on the road. Flat and hard, their voices named the sum owed down to the last dollar, and talked plainly of taking the claim, the cabin, even the mule, if payment did not come soon. When they rode off, her father sank into his chair like a man whose legs had simply given out from under him. That night, in a voice gone quiet with defeat, he admitted to Dyani that Holt's offer might be the only road left that kept the family whole, that without it, the bank would take everything, and Kai and Nita would most likely be split apart and handed off to whatever the county did with children left with nowhere to go. His failures, he confided, had landed square on her shoulders, and for that he was sorrier than he had words to carry. Firelight caught the shine standing in his eyes, and his hands would not still, no matter how hard he tried to hold them steady. Late that night, Dyani climbed to the loft and stood before the cracked square of mirror nailed crooked to the wall. A tired young woman looked back at her jaw set tight, shadows deep beneath her eyes, from too many nights spent awake doing arithmetic that never once came out right. She was no longer a girl who could afford to wait for the world to be kind to her. She lay listening to the wind claw at the roof and her father's labored breathing rising up through the floorboards below, and every road she turned over in her mind led back to the same hard truth waiting at the end of it. At dawn the peaks went pale gold under a thin, cold sky. When Dyani stepped onto the porch, Holt was already there beside a small wagon loaded with sacks and crates, 2 strong horses stamping and blowing steam into the morning air. Kai and Nita huddled together in the doorway. Her father leaned against the frame, shoulders bowed, eyes fixed hard on her face, as though trying to memorize it whole. Fear pulled her one way and duty pulled the other, while underneath both a thin, bright thread of hope pulled her toward the wagon and whatever waited beyond it. She walked down the steps until she stood in front of Holt. His face stayed steady, unhurried. He did not smile too wide or glance away, only waited on her answer. The way a man waits on weather he has already made peace with. Yes, she would go with him as his wife. Holt gave a single nod as though he understood exactly what the word had cost her, and held out his hand. His palm was rough and warm as he helped her up onto the wagon seat. The wheels creaked forward, carrying her away from the only home she had ever known, the cabin shrinking small behind them until it was nothing but a dark shape against the sky. Ahead, a narrow trail climbed into the high country. The higher they rose, the colder the air grew, and tall dark pines pressed close on either side, like something standing watch over the road. Dyani pulled her shawl tight and kept her eyes fixed on the far peaks. She had married a man who claimed to be as poor as any miner, and she had done it for her family's sake, and for a small, stubborn piece of her own hope besides. As the wagon rattled deeper into the mountains and Juniper Flat vanished behind them for good, a strange feeling settled over her, as though the land itself were holding its breath, waiting on some secret about Holt Bracken and the life he was driving her toward. For 2 full days the trail kept climbing. The air thinned, until every breath had to fight its way in, and cliffs rose gray and sheer on one side of the narrow track. Holt handled the horses with an easy, practiced grip, his eyes moving constantly over sky, rock, and tree line, saying little the whole while. They stopped beside a creek to rest the team, and he built a small fire in a few sure motions, the kind of motions a man makes when he has done a thing 10,000 times and stopped thinking about it long ago. Dyani sat on a flat stone with dry bread in her hands and studied him closely. On the surface he looked like any poor mountain man in a patched coat, but nothing about him moved careless. Every rope, every buckle, every step he took was neat, deliberate, planned, 3 moves ahead of where his boots actually stood. That night they slept under a canvas strung from the wagon to a pine, stars burning hard and cold overhead. Doubt pressed at her in the dark. She had tied her whole life to a man she barely knew. But she pictured her father's cough, pictured Kai and Nita curled together on their narrow bed, and the choice still felt solid in her chest, even with the doubt sitting right beside it uninvited. On the 3rd morning the land began to change. Thick pine gave way to gray rock and pale aspen, their white trunks bright against the slope. The wagon jolted hard over broken ground, and more than once Holt climbed down to steady a wheel or walk the horses around a sharp bend by hand. A cold wind rushed down off the peaks and reddened Dyani's cheeks raw. She watched him work, his coat worn thin, but his boots sound and well kept, his voice low, and even with the horses, the voice of a man used to training good stock, not scraping by on borrowed animals. When he paused to study the ridgeline, his shoulders squared in a way that did not belong to a drifter hunting for work. It belonged to a man checking on something that was already his to keep. Late in the afternoon they reached a narrow pass, cut between 2 walls of stone. The sky beyond had gone a softer, deeper blue. Holt drew the team to a stop and sat there a long moment, reins loose in his hands, without moving or speaking. The roughest stretch of trail lay behind them now, but the next rise would change everything, was all he offered. Low, an edge in it Dyani had not heard from him before, the sound of a man bracing for more than bad ground underfoot. He clicked to the horses, and the wagon rolled forward through the pass, bent around a stand of twisted pine, and then the whole world opened wide in front of them. Below lay a wide, hidden valley, cupped between steep slopes and dark timber. A clear river cut through the middle of it, catching the last light of the day. Even this close to winter, deep green meadow still showed through the early frost. It looked untouched, quiet, secret, and it was not empty. At the valley's heart stood a great lodge built of heavy logs and cut stone, broad porches wrapped clean around it. tall windows throwing back the sun, smoke rising steady from 3 chimneys at once. Fences and barns spread out in careful, orderly lines, and a drive swept down from the front doors to the very road where the wagon now stood frozen. This was not the home of a poor mountain man. It looked like something out of Dyani's borrowed book, a place built and held by someone with real money and real power behind him. As the wagon started down the winding track, Dyani gripped the seat with both hands, heart pounding hard against her ribs. Whose place was this? The question was barely out of her before Holt's answer came, quiet and level. Ember Ridge, he called the valley. The lodge itself was Ember House. It was his home, and now, he added, hers too. The words landed harder than the cold wind ever could have managed on their own. A tall man in clean work clothes and polished boots stepped out onto the front steps before she could answer, coming toward the wagon with an easy, certain stride, reading Holt by his full name, everything inside ready and waiting. In that moment, something in Holt changed. His shoulders set, his chin lifted, a quiet authority settled over him that had not been there on the trail a mile back. The same worn coat hung on his shoulders still, but he no longer looked like a man asking for a place in the world. He looked like the man who owned it outright. Inside, warm lamplight washed over paneled walls. A great stone hearth roared at one end of the room, soft rugs underfoot, deep chairs and heavy tables filling the space. Paintings of mountain and forest hung between tall windows. The air carried cedar and fresh bread and clean soap all at once. Dyani walked in slowly, almost afraid to touch anything. Her hands knew rough boards and chipped tin, not carved rails and thin porcelain cups. A woman in a neat apron brought tea in cups, so fine, Dyani was half afraid to close her fingers all the way around one. When the servant withdrew, the room went quiet, except for the low crack of the fire settling deeper into the grate. Holt stood in front of her then, and for the first time since she had met him on that porch back home, real fear showed plain in his eyes. Not fear of a storm or a bad trail, but fear of losing something that mattered to him more than either. There were things left unsaid between them, he began, not to trick her, but because he had needed to know who she truly was before laying the whole weight of his life into her hands. His full name was Holt Calloway. His father had built a timber company that held forests and mills across 3 counties along with this valley, and when the old man died, the company and Ember House had passed down to Holt alone. In Denver, people saw only the money and the land behind him. They flattered him, schemed around him, tried again and again to marry their daughters into his fortune, with soft words and hollow hearts hidden underneath. Tired of being treated like a prize instead of a man, he had gone up into the high country wearing a poor man's coat, hunting for someone who could see clean past everything he owned to whoever he actually was underneath it. Dyani listened in silence, heat rising steady in her cheeks. She had married him out of duty, and because she had sensed a steadiness in him that the whole valley below seemed to lack entirely. Now she understood that steadiness carried far more weight behind it than she had ever once guessed. Grateful the hard choice had led her here, or angry he had let her walk into it blind. She could not decide which feeling sat truer in her chest. Why her out of every woman in the territory he might have chosen instead? Holt's answer came, without a beat of hesitation, how she fought for a fair weight at the assayer's counter, how she shielded Kai and Nita from harsh words in town, how she met every hardship with her back straight and her chin level, no matter what it cost her. He needed a wife who would stand beside him when others tried to carve up his land and steer his life for him, not one who would flinch at the first sign of real trouble. Whatever she chose now, knowing the whole truth, he would keep his word regardless, clear her father's debts, see the cabin, and claims stayed safe in her family's hands either way. Dyani turned toward the fire and watched the flames move over the logs. A long while she thought of her father's cough, of Kai and Nita's thin arms, of the little garden scraped out of rocky ground below the cabin. She thought of this valley, strong and quiet, and of the man standing behind her, now without his mask on for the first time. Her heart ached, but underneath the ache sat the same stubborn strength that had carried her through every hard year before this one. She had never needed a rich man, she told him plainly, facing him at last, only an honest one. Now that the truth stood open between them, she would stay, and together they would meet whatever storm came for Ember Ridge, whether it blew down off the wild peaks or in from the polished streets of Denver. The first days at Ember House passed in something like a blur. Dyani learned the turns of the great lodge, the particular creak of its stairs, the way the valley held its quiet like something sacred, the way her own mother once described the old canyon camps she had grown up in, still and watchful at first light. The household staff watched her with careful curiosity, unsure whether to treat her as guest or as mistress of the house. Holt kept his word in every way that mattered. He walked the land with her, the mill road, the bunkhouses, the barns, the small school he had started for the workers' children, and he listened, truly listened, when she raised questions about wages and housing that most men in his position would never have bothered to answer honestly. When she pointed out a drafty wall or a sagging roof in the workers' quarters, he did not waver off. He wrote it down himself and had the foreman see to it inside the week. For a little while, she let herself believe this strange new life might settle into a steady shape after all. A letter reached Ember House that same week, carried up by one of Holt's riders from Juniper Flat. Kai's careful, blocky printing filled the first page, proud of every word he had managed to spell right on his own. Her father's cough, he wrote, had eased some since the debt collectors stopped riding out to the cabin, and Nita had grown 2 inches taller than the door latch, a fact she had apparently insisted he include. Dyani read it twice through by the window, then a third time out loud to Holt that evening by the fire, her voice catching once on the line about her father sleeping through a whole night without waking. It was the first letter she had ever received, addressed to her by name alone, and she folded it into the beaded comb case her mother had left her, the 2 treasures sitting together from that day forward. Then, on a sharp, clear afternoon, a carriage rolled up the drive with far too much polish and not nearly enough trail dust on it. Dark horses stamped the packed earth. A woman stepped down wrapped in a deep blue traveling cloak, hair pinned severe and neat, gray eyes cold as river ice. Holt went stiff at Dyani's side. His aunt, Vivian Calloway, the introduction came clipped and short. 2 men in fine city suits stepped down behind her, boots too clean, collars too stiff, the look of men who measured the whole world in profit and loss and little else besides. Inside, the great room filled fast with voices that did not belong to the valley at all. Vivian looked Dyani over slowly, head to boots, not cruel, exactly, but not kind either. A surprise, she called her, in a voice pitched loud enough to carry to every corner of the room. Had Holt truly married without so much as consulting the board first? The word board hung in the air like weather rolling in off the peaks. One of the suited men explained, smooth and careful, that the Calloway Timber Company stood on the edge of something large, offers on the table, contracts for development, fortunes that could triple if they cleared more forest, cut more roads, partnered with the right investors from back east. Vivian pressed every word like a weight set down on purpose. A venture of that size needed a proper image standing beside it, a solid, respectable marriage to a woman fit for a Denver drawing room. Someone from a known family with practiced manners, not a mountain girl with dirt still under her nails. Dyani felt the sting of it plainly, but kept her chin level through every word. His wife. His choice. Full stop. Holt's answer left no room for argument. Vivian's smile never once reached her eyes. Choices carried consequences, was all she allowed in return, and the board would not risk the company's whole future on a marriage made in the backwoods. That night, Dyani lay awake in a room far too grand for sleep, the mattress soft, the blankets thick, and still her stomach sat tight as a fist the whole night through. Through the window, the valley lay silver and peaceful under the moon. But inside these walls, something sharp and ugly was already taking shape behind closed doors. In the morning, she went looking for Holt, and found raised voices carrying clean through a half-open door down the hall. Vivian's tone cut through it sharp as a blade, unsuitable, untrained, a weight that would drag Holt down through every drawing room in Denver society. Investors walking the moment he clung to a woman with no name and no money behind her. Holt's voice came back rough with real anger. He would not trade his wife for a stack of contracts. He was not a piece to be shifted across some board for someone else's private gain. Naive. Sentiment made men weak. Weakness ruined empires built by stronger men than him. Vivian's reply carried no warmth in it at all. Dyani could have slipped away unseen, but something stubborn in her refused to hide from it any longer. She stepped into the doorway and made herself plainly known. Both of them turned, startled. Her hand shook, but her voice held steady. If they meant to weigh her like a bolt of cloth laid out on a scale, she had every right to stand on that scale herself and be counted. Vivian's brows lifted in thin surprise. This was business, nothing more. If Dyani truly cared for Holt, she would step aside quietly and let him secure the company's future without her standing in the way of it. Dyani looked her dead in the eye. What Holt needed was not a perfect hostess for his parlor, but someone willing to stand beside him when others tried to tear his home apart brick by brick. For a moment the whole room went very still. Holt looked at his wife with something close to awe plain on his face. Vivian's eyes only cooled further. There was one simple way she finally allowed to see whether Dyani could truly stand the pressure of Holt's world, a governor's reception in Denver, 1 week off, where every powerful man and woman in the territory would gather under a single roof. Walk into that room, hold her head up, and not crumble under the weight of their judgment, and Vivian would at least be willing to listen afterward. It was not a kind offer. It was a test built from the ground up to break her. After Vivian left, the anger in Holt's face softened slowly into worry. Dyani owed his aunt nothing at all. He offered quietly he would fight the board without dragging her into Denver's games, if that was what she wanted from him. Dyani looked down at her own work-rough hands, then out toward the mountains beyond the glass. The fight had already come looking for her, she countered. Vivian had already carried her name through every parlor and boardroom she could reach, and running now would undo none of the damage already done. Better to walk into the light and let them see her plainly than hide in shadow while they tore her apart in whispers behind closed doors. If there was to be a real fight for their marriage and for this valley, she wanted to stand inside it, not watch safely from the edge. Holt saw there was no shifting her once her mind had settled on a thing. Whatever waited for them in Denver, he promised, they would meet it standing side by side. Before the governor's ballroom decides whether this marriage survives, tap join beside the channel name and become a channel member. You'll want to be here for what Dyani does next. The days that followed went entirely to preparation. A seamstress came up from town and worked long hours in Dyani's room, cutting and stitching a gown that felt like a bridge built between two separate worlds, deep, forest green silk, cut simple enough that she could still move and breathe freely inside it. The household staff coached her through the basics of formal dining and the turns of a proper dance, and she practiced walking the long hall in unfamiliar shoes until she could glide across it without once catching a hem underfoot. Holt spent his nights bent over contracts and board notes, mapping exactly how much power his aunt truly held and where their best ground for a real fight might lie. On a beaded hair comb her mother had left behind, worn now only on days that truly mattered, Dyani ran her thumb slowly over the familiar pattern and thought of the old stories her grandmother used to tell about walking into hard rooms with a straight back. When the coach finally rolled out toward Denver, Ember House shrank behind them into the clear, cold light, and silently Dyani promised the valley she would come back stronger than she had left it. Snow streaked the high peaks as the road wound down out of stone and pine into rolling hills and fenced pasture. Mile by mile the wild country gave way, to farms, then to crowded little towns, smoke thickening the air, and telegraph lines running alongside the road like thin black ribs holding up the sky above them. By the time the city finally rose ahead, Dyani felt she had crossed clean into another country altogether. Denver was loud and busy. Wagons and riders jammed shoulder to shoulder through the streets. Brick buildings leaning close over the walks, people moving past in coats and hats of every cut she had never once seen before. The coach drew up outside a grand hotel, with a carved stone arch and gas lamps burning, even in broad daylight, casting a rich gold glow clean across the doors. Inside, perfume and polished wood filled the air together. Men in sharp suits kept their voices low and serious. Women moved through in bright silk, voices quick and light between them. For one heartbeat, Dyani felt very small indeed. A miner's daughter dropped straight into a world built to keep people exactly like her standing outside its doors. Then, Holt's hand closed around hers, warm and certain. She had faced down hunger and blizzard and men with cold eyes long before she ever laid eyes on a chandelier, he reminded her low, close to her ear. Not one soul inside this hotel had ever heard a wolf cry across open snow at midnight, had ever stood between a storm and the people they loved and simply refused to move an inch. Nothing left in this room could frighten her that she had not already met and outlasted in a far harder shape. Later, as evening settled over the city, they stood outside the ballroom doors while music drifted through the gap, and servants moved in and out carrying trays that caught the light like still water. A man waited by the entrance to announce their names to the room beyond. Vivian was already inside somewhere, no doubt, turning heads and planting stories with every practiced smile she owned. Dyani drew one full breath, lifted her chin, and stepped forward into the light. Soft music rolled through the Denver ballroom as the tall doors swung open wide. Chandelier light spilled over polished floors and bright gowns moving beneath it. A man at the entrance called out Holt's name, and Calloway timber rolled across the room like a slow drumbeat working its way through the crowd. Heads turned toward the man in the plain black coat and the young woman beside him in green silk, the color of pine after rain. For one heartbeat, Dyani wanted badly to turn straight back around. The air smelled of perfume and roasted meat. Diamonds and gold caught the light in every direction she looked. No one in this room knew a thing about thin gardens or cracked dishes or mountain wind cutting clean through every coat a person owned. They knew ledgers and railroads and power plain and simple, and little else worth knowing. Her heart pounded hard, but she lifted her chin anyway and stepped forward on Holt's arm all the same. Men in fitted dark suits crossed toward Holt almost at once, pumping his hand, using his first name with easy, familiar smiles, their eyes sliding over Dyani quick and cool, weighing her and setting her aside in the very same glance. She felt every one of those looks land on her skin like an actual touch, but kept her shoulders straight and met each glance without blinking once. If she could face down a Colorado blizzard alone on a mountain trail, she could stand steady through one crowded room full of strangers. Vivian appeared out of the crush wrapped in deep red silk, gray eyes sharp above a smooth, practiced smile. She greeted Holt warmly, then let her gaze travel slowly over Dyani, boots to hair, before turning to the small crowd around them. A mountain girl could be made almost presentable, she offered, pitched just loud enough to carry, given enough work put into the project. A few women nearby smirked behind their fans, waiting for Dyani to flinch under it. Instead, gratitude for the dressmaker came easy and unhurried from Dyani's mouth, though she cared a good deal more. She added about strong cloth and a straight seam. then about city ruffles ever sewn purely for show. The words were simple, but they did not bend an inch under the weight Vivian had meant to put on them. A couple of the men nearby hid quick smiles behind their glasses. A thin line tightened at the corner of Vivian's mouth. The blow she had aimed so carefully had not landed anywhere near where she meant it to fall. Vivian brought forward a tall man with silver at his temples and manners polished smooth as river stone, a major investor eyeing deep cutting rights across the Calloway forests for himself and his partners. Progress and jobs and the fortunes waiting in the high country timber filled his opening remarks, warm and practiced, before he turned to Dyani with a pleasant look that never once reached his eyes. Could someone from so small a settlement truly understand plans of that scale? Dyani thought of hillsides stripped bare, of brown water running where clear water used to run, of cabins buried under slides that never would have moved an inch if the trees above them had been left standing where they belonged. Plainly, steadily, she laid out what happened when too many trees came down too fast. Springs turned to mud, roads washed clean out. Families paid the price when storms hit ground with nothing left to hold it together anymore. Her voice never once rose. She simply described what she had watched happen with her own eyes. Growing up on land her people had read and understood for longer than anyone standing in that room could likely count back. The small circle around them went quiet, fast. The investor's confident smile thinned considerably by the end of it. Into that silence stepped another voice, warm and certain, drawing the whole circle's attention. The governor himself had come close enough to listen for the last several minutes. Real respect showed in the way he took Dyani's hand, asking her plainly to keep talking. She did. Several minutes more of fair wages, of safer logging camps, of cutting timber, in a way that still left strong stands, standing tall for whoever came after her own generation was gone. The governor listened and agreed out loud more than once in front of the whole gathered room. The feel of the crowd shifted just slightly in her direction. Men who had looked straight past her only an hour earlier now watched her with real, careful interest of their own. Vivian stood at the edge of the circle, eyes gone cold and hard as flint. She slipped away toward a knot of serious faces gathered near the wall, and when she returned, an older judge walked beside her, carrying a worn leather folder, her own smile bright and sharp as a blade drawn fresh in lamplight. The judge, she announced, had reviewed the Calloway family papers and found a serious concern about Holt's recent marriage the board could not simply overlook any longer. Judge Pruitt opened the folder and laid it out plainly. Holt's inheritance carried strict conditions. Any marriage that might threaten the company's stability could be legally challenged under its terms, and certain required approvals had never once been properly filed. In his stated view, the union did not fully meet the terms laid down in the will. Nearby guests fell silent all at once, hungry for scandal, watching closely to see Dyani finally fall. The words landed like cold water thrown straight in her face, but they did not knock her down. Might she see the paper herself? The request came calm and clear, and the judge, caught off guard, handed it over without much thought. She read every line slowly, the way she had once read claim notices by lantern light, back at the kitchen table, her finger tracing the cramped legal script until she found exactly what she had been searching for. The clause did not speak only of risk. It also stated in plain terms anyone could follow, that a marriage could be upheld and defended if it strengthened the company's standing through public service rendered to the territory and its people. Could the judge confirm that part aloud for the whole room to hear plainly? He did, his voice noticeably less certain than it had sounded only a moment before. Turning to the governor directly, Dyani asked whether acting as a voice for mountain families and advising on fair timber practice across the whole territory would count as public service in his own eyes. He studied her a long moment, then nodded slowly, decision settling into his face. He had already been weighing exactly such a role for some time, he allowed, and her words tonight had settled the matter for him completely. Before the gathered crowd, he offered Dyani an unpaid appointment as advisor on high country affairs. A secretary stepped forward with a short letter bearing the territorial seal already pressed into the wax. Dyani's hand trembled only once as she signed her name in careful, steady strokes across the bottom of the page. Clearing his throat, the judge conceded plainly that her new standing removed any legal question the board had thought to raise against the marriage. A murmur moved through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Vivian's face went pale, then stiff as stone, standing in the lamplight. The blade she had sharpened so carefully had turned neatly in her own hand instead. Holt stepped to Dyani's side, thanked the officials with measured, even words, and turned to his aunt with a low, steady warning. His marriage was no longer any business of hers to touch. Not now, not ever again. Vivian's lips pressed into a thin, hard line. For a moment it looked as though she might argue further still, but nothing was left that she could say that would not make her look small in front of the governor, the judge, and half the powerful men of the territory gathered around them. At last she turned and walked back into the crowd, alone, the bright silk of her dress moving behind her like a banner in slow retreat. Later, out on the hotel balcony, the city lights below looked like scattered embers laid out across the dark valley floor. The air was cold and clean against her face. Dyani felt the whole night's strain settle into her shoulders alongside the solid weight of what they had just won together, standing side by side. He had thought he was bringing her into his world that evening, Holt admitted quietly, and instead he had watched her stand in front of the whole of it and simply refused to bend an inch. Every single minute of it had frightened her, Dyani allowed in turn, and she had done it anyway, because some things were plainly worth being afraid for. They rode home to Ember Ridge a few days later. When the hidden valley opened beneath them again and the lodge came into view, it looked the same, and somehow entirely different all at once, no longer only Holt's secret refuge, but their shared work now together, side by side. The changes came steadily, one by one, through that whole first winter. Workers' cabins were rebuilt sound and warm. A small schoolhouse opened proper near the mill road at last. A trail medic was hired on, so a winter fever or a broken bone no longer turned into tragedy for want of care close at hand. At company meetings, Holt fought hard for better practice across every camp, and when officials rode up from the city to inspect the operation, Dyani met them on the porch herself and walked them through the timber personally, mile by careful mile. Trees still came down, but new ones went into the ground behind them every season now. Crews learned to leave strong stands standing along the steepest slopes instead of cutting them clean down to bare scar. The company kept right on making money, but it made that money now on land still able to breathe. Vivian never tried again to undo the marriage after that night. Time and distance wore steadily at whatever plans she still had left, and word drifted up now and then that some of her city schemes had come apart quietly on their own. At Ember Ridge, life simply moved on without her, season after season. Dyani's father lived to see the first snow fall on Ember Ridge that winter. Brought up from Juniper Flat in a wagon padded thick with blankets, his cough finally easing in air he swore was cleaner than any he had breathed underground. Kai grew into a boy who could name every timber stand on the mountain before he turned 12, trailing after Holt's foreman with a notebook of his own. Nita took to the schoolhouse Holt had built for the workers' children and never once looked back at the barefoot years below the cabin. Children's laughter began to fill the halls of Ember House before too many more winters had passed through the valley. Dyani and Holt's own, and Kai and Nita besides, all of them raised knowing both sides of where they came from, the mine and the mountain both. The great room fire burned warm on the coldest nights, while Holt and Dyani sat side by side, planning the next season together, instead of bracing alone for the next storm to break over them. If watching a woman win by her own nerve keeps you coming back, become a channel member, tap join beside the channel name, and stay for the next one. Some evenings when the wind ran hard through the pines above Ember House, Dyani stood out on the wide front porch and simply listened to it move. She remembered the thin garden behind her father's failing cabin, the rough wagon rocking along the narrow trail, the first stunned sight of the lodge rising out of a hidden valley, the bright Denver ballroom where strangers had tried to weigh her worth and found, in the end, they could not hold the scale steady against her. A poor mountain drifter she had believed Holt to be when she married him, and found instead a partner carrying a hidden kingdom through the wild. A man who had chosen her not as a rescue owed to her, but as an equal standing beside him from the very first night. Together they turned a secret lodge into a living home, and a hard, grasping business into something that could finally stand out in open daylight. The mountains around Ember Ridge kept their old silence, the way mountains always do, but inside that quiet Dyani and Holt built a life of courage, loyalty, and the kind of deep, steady love that no ant, no board, and no city full of judgment would ever manage to take from them again.